You watch a video of someone teaching their dog to sit, using a treat, a clicker, and a calm, repeated command. It looks simple, structured, like something a person designed on purpose. But the real answer to how this relationship actually began is far stranger than any training video could suggest, because your ancestors almost certainly didn't sit down one day and decide to train a wolf. There was no clicker, no leash, no deliberate plan to turn a dangerous predator into a companion. The truth involves scavenging, fear thresholds, and an accidental partnership that unfolded over thousands of years, largely without anyone directing it at all. This is the story of how dogs may have actually domesticated themselves and what that reveals about the strange, quiet way evolution sometimes works. Start with the picture most people carry in their heads. Ancient humans found wolf puppies, raised them by hand, and slowly bred the friendliest ones together, generation after generation, until wolves became dogs. It's a tidy story. It feels intentional and controlled. Researcher Raymond Coppinger, a biologist who spent decades studying dog behavior and domestication, argued that this popular version leaves out something crucial. Deliberately capturing and raising wild wolf pups is extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Even for experienced modern trainers working with far tamer, generations-removed wolf populations today. A truly wild wolf pup, even hand-raised from birth, typically retains strong fear responses and unpredictable aggression that resist easy training no matter how much care and effort a person puts in. So if early humans weren't successfully hand-taming wild wolf pups on a large scale, how did dogs come to exist at all? Coppinger's answer reframes the entire story. He proposed that domestication wasn't something humans did to wolves. It was something a specific subset of wolves did to themselves. To understand why this matters, think about the sheer physical risk involved in the traditional story. A wild wolf, even as a young pup, grows into an animal with powerful jaws, sharp instincts, and a nervous system finely tuned for detecting threats. Raising one by hand in a world without reinforced enclosures, veterinary knowledge, or reliable food supplies for a growing predator would have been an enormous gamble for very little guaranteed benefit. Even in cases where early humans might have occasionally succeeded in raising an individual wolf pup, Coppinger argued this kind of isolated, individual taming wouldn't have been enough to explain how an entire, widespread, genetically distinct species emerged. A single tamed wolf doesn't produce a global population of dogs. Something larger, more consistent, and more automatic had to be happening. Here's how that theory works, step by step. Ancient human camps, especially once fire and semi-permanent settlements became common, generated something wolves had never encountered before at scale: consistent, accessible piles of food waste. Bones, scraps, discarded parts of hunted animals left near the edges of human settlements. For a wild wolf population, this was a genuine opportunity. Free calories without the risk and energy cost of hunting large prey. But approaching a human camp came with an obvious problem. Humans were dangerous. A wolf that got too close, too aggressive, or too unpredictable around a group of armed humans risked being killed. This created what biologists call a selection pressure, meaning an environmental condition that consistently favors certain traits over others across generations, because individuals with those traits survive and reproduce more successfully than individuals without them. In this case, the pressure favored calmness. Specifically, it favored a trait researchers call reduced flight distance, meaning how close a wild animal will allow a human to approach before running away. Wolves with naturally lower flight distances, wolves slightly calmer and more tolerant around humans, could safely access the food scraps near camps. Wolves with high flight distance, more fearful, more reactive wolves, stayed farther away, missing out on this reliable new food source. Over many generations, this consistent pressure would have gradually shifted an entire local wolf population toward calmer, more human-tolerant individuals, not because any human was deliberately selecting or breeding them, but simply because calmer wolves ate better and survived better near human settlements. You can think of this a little like an informal filter sifting a population over time, without any single decision-maker running the process. No individual human ever chose which wolves got to eat and which didn't. The camp itself and the behavior it demanded for safe access did that sifting automatically, generation after generation, favoring one trait consistently enough that it accumulated into real, lasting biological change. Isn't it strange to think dogs might exist today primarily because certain wolves were simply braver around garbage? This is where a separate but closely related research finding becomes essential to understanding just how powerful this kind of unintentional selection can be. In the late 1950s, Soviet geneticist Dmitry Belyaev began a long-term experiment studying silver foxes, animals genetically related to dogs but never previously domesticated. Belyaev's research team selected foxes for breeding based on exactly one trait: how calm and non-aggressive they were around humans. Nothing else. Not appearance, not intelligence, just tameness. Within only a handful of generations, something remarkable happened. The foxes didn't just become calmer around people. They began developing physical traits nobody had specifically bred for: floppier ears, curlier tails, patches of different colored fur, even slightly shorter snouts in some individuals. These are traits strikingly similar to features seen across many modern dog breeds. Belaev's experiment, later continued and expanded by geneticist Ludmila Trut, demonstrated something profound. Selecting purely for tameness appears to trigger a cascade of related physical and behavioral changes, likely connected to shared biological pathways controlling stress hormones and developmental timing during an animal's growth. Researchers studying this phenomenon have proposed a specific biological explanation, sometimes referred to as the domestication syndrome. The idea centers on a group of cells present very early in an embryo's development, called neural crest cells, which eventually migrate throughout the body and contribute to a wide range of tissues, including pigment cells that determine fur color, cartilage that shapes ears and skulls, and portions of the adrenal system that regulate stress hormones. Selecting for calm, low-stress behavior may inadvertently affect how these cells develop and migrate, producing the unexpected side effects seen in Belaev's foxes: floppier ears, patchy coloring, curlier tails, all seemingly unrelated traits connected underneath by shared developmental biology. This gives powerful support to Coppinger's theory. If simply selecting for calmness around humans could produce dog-like physical traits in foxes within a few decades, under controlled conditions, then a similar, slower, natural version of that same pressure, unfolding gradually near ancient human camps over thousands of years, could plausibly explain how wild wolves gradually became something recognizably different. Early proto-dogs. Now, this raises an important question. Even if wolves were self-selecting for calmness near human camps, at what point did the relationship become genuinely two-directional? At what point did humans start actively participating rather than simply tolerating scavengers at the edge of camp? This is where genetic research adds crucial detail to the story. Geneticist Gregor Larson, who has led extensive research into the genetic history of dog domestication, has studied ancient DNA extracted from dog and wolf remains found at archaeological sites across Europe and Asia. Larson's research suggests dog domestication likely occurred somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, an unusually wide range that reflects just how difficult it is to pinpoint a single moment when wolves became genetically distinct as dogs. Larson's work also revealed something surprising. Genetic evidence suggests dog domestication may have happened more than once, in more than one location, potentially with different wolf populations independently developing this early scavenger relationship with different early human groups in different regions, before those separate domestication events eventually merged and mixed through later human migration and trade. This detail matters because it reinforces just how natural and repeatable this process seems to have been. It wasn't a single lucky, deliberate human invention. It was closer to a recurring pattern, one that emerged wherever humans and wolves shared overlapping territory and enough ecological opportunity for this specific kind of relationship to take hold. Larson's genetic research also revealed a puzzle that remains only partially resolved even today. Modern dog breeds show clear genetic divergence from wolves, but pinpointing the exact ancestral wolf population, or populations that gave rise to modern dogs, has proven surprisingly difficult, partly because the wolf populations most closely related to early dogs appear to have gone extinct themselves, leaving modern wolves as more distant cousins rather than direct ancestors. This means the wolves living today aren't quite the same as the specific population that first began this relationship with humans thousands of years ago, adding another layer of complexity to reconstructing exactly how and where the earliest domestication process unfolded. So the wolves changed, slowly, biologically, through unintentional selection favoring calmness. But something else had to happen too, something psychological, for this relationship to eventually become the deep partnership you recognize in dogs today. This is where researcher Brian Hare's work becomes central to the story. Hare, a cognitive scientist who has spent much of his career studying dog cognition compared to wolves and other primates, discovered something genuinely surprising about how dogs understand humans. Hare's research demonstrated that dogs are remarkably skilled at reading human gestures, specifically pointing gestures to locate hidden food, far more skilled at this specific task than wolves, and even more skilled than chimpanzees, despite chimpanzees being far more closely related to humans genetically. This was a significant finding because it suggested dogs hadn't just become physically tamer. They had developed a specific specialized cognitive ability to interpret human communication and intention. Hare proposed that this ability likely emerged as a direct consequence of the same self-domestication process described earlier. As wolves became calmer and less reactive around humans, generation after generation, this reduction in fear and stress response may have simultaneously freed up cognitive and social capacity for something new, paying closer attention to human behavior and learning to interpret human social cues as useful rather than simply threatening. Hare tested this idea directly by comparing dogs not just to wolves but to human infants at a similar stage of cognitive development. In several of his studies, young dogs performed comparably to human toddlers when it came to following a pointing gesture toward hidden food, a task that requires understanding that another individual's gesture carries meaningful information about the world. Wolves raised in near-identical conditions to the dogs in these studies, sometimes even hand-raised by humans from a very young age, consistently failed to perform at the same level, suggesting the difference wasn't simply about upbringing or exposure to humans. It pointed to something deeper, a genuine difference in underlying cognitive wiring between dogs and wolves. This is genuinely counterintuitive, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The popular assumption is that ancient humans actively taught wolves to understand human gestures and commands, the same way a modern trainer teaches a dog to sit or stay. But Hare's research suggests something closer to the opposite process. The capacity to read and respond to human cues may have emerged naturally, as an unplanned side effect of selection for calmness, long before any deliberate human training began. In other words, dogs may have essentially trained themselves to understand you before your ancestors ever intentionally trained them to do anything at all. Doesn't that completely flip the usual story? Instead of humans imposing structure onto wild animals, this version describes wolves gradually adapting themselves to fit into human social environments, developing new instincts and even new communicative abilities almost entirely through unintentional pressure and self-selection. Only after this long, slow, largely accidental process, calmer wolves scavenging safely near camps, then gradually developing sharper skill at reading human behavior, would deliberate human involvement likely have entered the picture in a more meaningful way. Once proto-dogs were already calm, already food-motivated around humans, and already unusually attentive to human gestures and behavior, actual intentional training, teaching specific behaviors, reinforcing useful traits like guarding, herding, or alerting to danger would have become dramatically easier and more effective than it ever could have been with a genuinely wild, fearful wolf. This likely explains why archaeological evidence shows dogs appearing in increasingly specialized roles relatively quickly once true domestication was established. Hunting companions, camp guardians, and eventually herding animals, roles that require exactly the kind of close behavioral coordination and communication that Hare's research suggests dogs were already unusually well equipped for, thanks to that earlier unintentional selection process. Archaeological sites across Europe and Asia have turned up burials where dogs were interred alongside humans with clear care and intention, sometimes positioned close to the human remains, occasionally even accompanied by markers suggesting a degree of ceremonial significance. Findings like these suggest that fairly early in the domestication timeline, dogs had already moved beyond simple usefulness and into something resembling genuine social bonding, a level of relationship that would be difficult to explain if the connection between humans and dogs were purely functional, based only on hunting assistance or camp protection. So the full picture looks something like this. Ecological opportunity. Food scraps near human camps created a natural selection pressure favoring calmer wolves. That selection pressure, mirrored decades later in Belyaev's fox experiments, produced not just tamer behavior but a wider set of physical and biological changes. Those changes appear to have unlocked new cognitive abilities demonstrated by Hare's research, allowing proto-dogs to read and respond to human communication in ways no other species manages as effectively. And only once that entire foundation existed did deliberate human training and selective breeding for specific working roles become truly effective, layering intentional culture on top of an already unintentional biological transformation. This reframes the entire relationship you might have with a dog today, whether that's a working farm dog, a guide dog, or a dog curled up on a couch beside you right now. Think about what actually happens during a modern dog training session, the kind shown in that video from the beginning. A person gives a hand signal. The dog watches closely, reads the gesture, and responds appropriately. This exact interaction, a dog carefully interpreting human intention through gesture and expression, is only possible because of a cognitive ability that appears to trace directly back to that ancient accidental selection process near early human campsites, long before anyone ever said the word training. Modern behavioral researchers studying dog cognition have continued building on Hare's original findings, exploring just how deeply attuned dogs are to human emotional expression, tone of voice, and even subtle shifts in body language, abilities that go well beyond simple command recognition. Some studies have found dogs capable of distinguishing between genuine human emotional expressions and posed or exaggerated ones, suggesting an unusually sophisticated capacity for reading human social signals, refined over an extraordinarily long shared evolutionary history. This is worth pausing on, because it reshapes something you might take for granted every time you interact with a dog. That instinctive sense that a dog seems to understand you, seems to track your mood, your gestures, even your tone, isn't simply the product of modern selective breeding for cute, sociable companions. It's the continuation of an ancient biological and cognitive process that began entirely by accident, near the edges of prehistoric human camps, powered by nothing more sophisticated than food scraps and the quiet advantage of staying calm. There's a broader pattern worth recognizing here, too, one that shows up in other places once you start looking for it. Many of the most successful, most enduring relationships between species, and even between people, aren't built primarily through deliberate design. They emerge gradually, through repeated small interactions, mutual advantage, and incremental trust, long before anyone involved fully understands what's actually happening or why. The dog curled up beside you today is, in a very real sense, living proof of exactly that kind of slow, unplanned, mutually beneficial process, playing out successfully across an almost unimaginable span of time. Now bring this back to that modern moment, the training video, the treat, the clicker, the calm repeated command. That interaction feels intentional, structured, entirely human-directed, and in a narrow, immediate sense, it is. But underneath it sits an enormous, largely accidental evolutionary process, unfolding across tens of thousands of years, involving calm wolves surviving better near ancient campfires, unintentional selection reshaping an entire species, and a remarkable cognitive shift that gave dogs an almost unique ability among animals to read and respond to human behavior. You didn't inherit a trained animal. You inherited the end result of one of the strangest, quietest, most successful unintentional partnerships in the entire history of your species. One that began not with a plan, but with scraps of food, a little bit of courage, and a slowly shrinking distance between a wild animal and a warm, flickering fire. You watch a video of someone teaching their dog to sit, using a treat, a clicker, and a calm, repeated command. It looks simple, structured, like something a person designed on purpose. But now you understand the real training happened tens of thousands of years earlier, and it wasn't your ancestors doing the teaching at all.